Every human has a negative impact on landscapes unless we stop and talk to the landscape.
That brings to mind that Margaret Mead quote, "Don't underestimate the power of a few dedicated individuals to change the world."
People recognise there is a problem with climate, but what can I do? There's nothing I can do. Well, yes, you can.
If you paint a picture of the transformation that can happen as a consequence, that is pretty impactful.
NSF is a solution. We're not interested in fear. We're not interested in anything else. We're interested in solutions. The consumer must be the ones that to create the change.
Hello and welcome to the Positive Development Podcast. My name is Bart Colen and this is my co-host, Dante Ciolfi.
Hey, Bart. Hey, Stuart. Stuart, I'm excited to have you today.
Yeah, nice to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, thanks to both of you for being here because I really enjoy chatting with both of you and exploring ideas. So, just to give our viewers a little bit of context, the Positive Development Podcast explores the shift from sustainable development's frequently cautious approach of do less harm to positive development's more forward-leaning and optimistic approach of do more good. Each week, we engage with experts from diverse fields, asking questions relating to three key principles: a shift in mindset, the practical application of do more good approaches, and the global replicability of such approaches. These questions unearth innovative yet practical ways individuals and organizations can amplify their impact through positive development. And this week, I'm very, very pleased indeed to introduce our very first guest on the Positive Development Podcast, my friend and also someone that Dante is acquainted with, Stuart Andrews. Stuart, welcome again. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here. Looking forward to it.
So just to provide our viewers with a little bit of context, can you just give us a thumbnail of the work you do, what natural sequence farming is, maybe what some of its key pillars are?
Yeah, sure. So natural sequence farming is really about the understanding of the Australian landscape and how the Australian landscape formed and how it functions prior to, say, humans having any interference on here. And we believe that if we were to study the Australian landscape and understand its function, it holds the key for the rehabilitation of the entire world. Given that it's the oldest, flattest, driest inhabited continent, it by rights should have washed into the sea by now, and it hasn't. So how has it not done that? And so they're the key elements. You know, you look at in the States, you've had the fires, you've had the hurricanes, you know, all of these things. There's keys in this old landscape as to how you can manage those sort of events. So really, that's the crux of it, I suppose. And so what we do is we've got a couple of farms that we run in Australia, and we run training courses teaching people about natural sequence farming and how they can utilize this on their landscapes. Our key pillars we have 5 key pillars, and they are slow the flow, let all plants grow, be careful where the animals go, filtration is a must-know, and return to the top to recycle the lot. Now, that's the understanding of how a landscape functions. Then, as a farmer or a landscape steward, you would look to say, right, if we get the landscape functioning, now what is the production system we overlay over the top of that? The mistake I think we always make in any sort of agricultural pursuits is we go to a landscape and we say, I'm going to do this to that landscape, rather than ask the landscape, what is it capable of giving? And I think that's a key, and it's not just in farming, it's in all landscapes, whether it be urban or not. We go there and we just force our hand because we can, and then we sit back and go, well, gee, I really don't know why that went wrong.
Right. Right.
But if we ask the land, all of the answers we require are right there in front of our face.
Mm. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that's an approach that really applies to a lot of things that we do in life in general that have nothing to
Everything.
do with agriculture. Going in with a preconceived notion of, obviously it's always good to have clarity and a sense of direction, but going in with such a narrow focus that it has to be this particular way. And it's interesting, not to crowbar this in here, and I don't think it is, but in a lot of ways, that's also the essence of the positive development paradigm, is opening up our minds and taking off the blinders, and at least being willing to consider other ways to go about it, whatever it is that we're doing.
I mean, if you look at it from a business standpoint, so let's say you're the manager or the owner of a business, and you have people working for you as either part of the team or employees. If you focus all of your attention on the business and nothing on the employees, then your business fails, right? So how is it any different? If you focus all of your attention on what you're going to do to the landscape without actually asking the landscape, well, the result's going to be the same. And of course it is, everywhere we go. Everywhere we go, the results we're seeing in the landscape are a result of humans' actions upon it.
This might be a deviation, Stuart, from where we're going with this, but I'm just curious, is it your opinion that some deviation has occurred over the hundreds of years that Australia has been occupied, some deviation from Aboriginal practices that are detrimental as well?
I think all humans. I don't think you can exclude anybody. This is a thing that, we focus on, whether it be Aboriginal, Indigenous people, and they have a much softer hand on the landscape, a much greater understanding of how landscapes function, but a minimal amount of tools to be able to use. What we have are all of these tools, and we've used all of them to extreme and with no consideration for the landscape. So the likes of the Aboriginal people, if we focus on Australia, the Aboriginal people's main tool they had to utilise was fire. And they used it. We don't really know how it was used. We have ideas as to how we think it was used, because the unfortunate part is white man came here and just dominated Aboriginal people rather than actually ask them, hey, listen, what's going on in this country? You've probably been here for a little while. Do you understand how this landscape functions? That would be a really good idea if we had have done that, but we didn't. The English came here and chose that dominating was probably a better way to go. This is exactly the same thing that I'm talking about. Now, the Aboriginal people had one tool, that one tool being fire. Was that a positive? Was it a negative? We believe it was a negative. Now, if you use fire, you use one tool, and you use the same tool over and over again, eventually what happens is the landscape starts to become accustomed to that tool. So if you look at Australia, what we have today is a landscape dominated by vegetation that must burn. Not will burn, must burn. Now that component, that started and a change in the biodiversity, because it once was a biodiverse community of plants, and a lot of them would not burn. But now we've got most of our landscape that must burn. At some point it must burn.
Like eucalyptus?
Eucalyptus, yeah. A lot of those fire-loving species, eucalyptus, acacias, a lot of those plants are fire-loving type plants, right? So they have evolved over a long period of time to manage to be able to deal with fire. And the ones that can tolerate fire, that repel fire, are lost. Because as you have more fire-loving plants, your landscape becomes hotter and drier, which means it then burns more. Yep. So over 60,000 or maybe 80,000 years, but no one seems to be really sure how long the Aboriginal people were here, the management, the use of fire did change the landscape. only in small components, but it changed something that was really important, and that was the balance of the biodiversity of plants. And it was the balance of the biodiversity of plants that stabilized this continent. As soon as that changed, the degradation started. So the degradation of this landscape would have started 60 to 80,000 years ago. I mean, it resulted in the loss of the megafauna. Like, how did they disappear? What happened? Some people would say that they were hunted into out of existence. We would contend that more than likely they died out as a result of a loss of a food source.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you think about that, what would be their food source? That they had a lot of fruits and berries and so forth, and that vegetation would have been taken out by fire. So if that was the case, then very early on, that megafauna, which was a big part of the stability of the continent, were lost. So now we've lost a major, the herbivores moving around our landscape, managing the vegetation. Gone. You see, so every human, I mean, you don't even need to argue. I don't know why people need to argue about this. I just put every human in the same bucket. We're all land destroyers. It's not like anyone can sit proud out there and say, well, no, I'm really good and you're really bad. Bullshit. No, everybody, every human has a negative impact on landscapes unless we stop and talk to the landscape. And that's what's key.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I'm thinking to an interview of Martin Royd's with Charlie Arnott. And obviously, I don't know if you know Martin personally, but I know you certainly know Charlie. Yeah.
I very well. Yep.
Yeah, I figured you would, because your dad's worked a lot with Martin. And Charlie was asking kind of a similar question to what Dante asked. And he said, we've shifted in these last couple hundred years and it's gotten worse. And Martin made a very good point. He said, really, if you go back through most civilizations, you'll find that over time, part of the reason why they decline is because they are quickly or slowly degrading the landscape. Like the example Martin gave was the southern Mediterranean, the northern coast of Africa, which used to be the breadbasket of Rome. And now a lot of those places have been turned basically into desert. So I think that really underscores the point that you're making, that really any kind of human activity, yes, there'll be degrees, but basically any kind of human activity is going to have a serious impact on the landscape.
So certainly it can. Yeah, I think there is a balance point though, where we can live in harmony with the land, and it doesn't mean that we take off our clothes, put on a loincloth and wander around the landscape. We can achieve it, but we must have the understanding as to how the landscape managed without us. And then we must try to fit our systems within that. We just have to change our viewpoint. Our viewpoint is always forcing ourselves onto a landscape or into a landscape rather than understanding the landscape first and then only putting in place what fits that particular landscape. If we go out into the desert and think we're going to maintain cropping, it's not going to work, is it? So you wouldn't go out into the desert and start growing wheat because it's not going to work. Yeah. So you would go out. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead, Stuart.
So if you were to go out in the desert, you go, okay, well, you ask the desert, so, what's going on here? Well, what are you lacking? Well, it's pretty bloody obvious. It's a desert. It was lacking a small water cycle. There's no rainfall. There's no moisture. So the first thing we would look to do is recreate the small water cycle so that we can get things functioning, and over time, who knows? We probably can get to the point that you could grow crops there, but you must get these other components going first. If you just go out there and say, righto, I'm going to grow crops because I know that there's underground water here, so what I'll do is I'll pump the water out and grow the crops. Well, all it does is eventually destroy whatever water was in the ground. That disappears. We haven't reintroduced a small water cycle, so the system only goes so far, then collapses.
And you're probably almost, if you were to do something like that, you'd almost, I would guess, probably be unbalancing the system even further.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, but you could force production out of it.
Right.
You could do it. You could throw fertilizer on. You could throw water on. You can grow anything you like, but it can only be sustained so long as those resources can keep being added. As soon as the resources run out or they're no longer affordable, zippo, gone.
Yeah.
Destroyed.
Well, it's interesting because I live here. I am 50 miles west of Chicago, about 80 kilometers west of Chicago. And it's a pretty significant agriculture area. And it's very eerie driving around sort of in the fall when the corn is really high, almost unnaturally high. And it's all a uniform height. It's almost as if they're working from the exact same seed. And it just makes me wonder how unnatural that whole process is and what is being done to that system in such an unnatural way that's almost forcing the landscape to grow these unnatural seeds. Again, obviously, I don't have anything like the expertise but you have, but just seeing something like that, now that I'm familiar with your work, your father's work, it just feels very ominous in a way when I see that kind of production.
Well, I ask both of you this question, right? Would you consider the likes of a rainforest to be natural?
I would say yes.
Yep. Dante?
In its current state, yes.
Okay. So walk into the rainforest. I want you to think about that you are both now walking into a rainforest. What do you see?
I see Bart with a loincloth.
Has he caught much?
Go ahead, Bart. You first.
Well, I'm going to let you go first because I think
Okay.
I know, just because I'm familiar with Stuart's work, I think I know what he's getting at. So I want to see what you think, and then I'll say what I think.
Well, I've never been in a rainforest, but I would guess I see a lot of overgrowth. I see incredible variety and speciation that I'm not used to in North America for sure. And yeah, that's kind of my gut feeling.
Variety and diversity, is that what we're getting at? Because I think that is,
That's
right,
exactly
Stuart?
what we're getting at. So
Yeah.
now go back to your corn crop. Can you see a comparison or absolutely no comparison at all? I'll ask
Monoculture.
it for you.
Yeah,
There
a
is
monoculture. Yeah, a monoculture is unnatural by definition.
no comparison. No
Yeah.
comparison. So a rainforest has been able to exist for thousands of years. That corn crop, no hope. It will be wiped out. If you don't prop it up with fertilizer and chemical, that corn crop will be gone. I mean, they would be fighting against insect attack all the time. Not natural.
Integral to that defect in the corn crop is the non-harmonious nature of how it's been farmed, right? It hasn't been farmed with the environment in mind.
Exactly.
So really quickly, I don't know if you can explain this quickly or at least give a bit of a thumbnail perhaps. When you're talking about asking a landscape, what does that look like? What is that process? For example,
Okay.
when you went up to forage farms, which is now where you and your family live, what were you looking for? What were, metaphorically speaking, the questions you were asking that environment?
Well, the first thing I looked for were patterns in the landscape. So the old patterns in the landscape, the old patterns of water flows told me how that landscape used to behave in relation to water. Because at the end of the day, water is one of the most critical components that we impact, as in humans impact on the earth. We impact how water moves and then change its relationship with the land. So the first thing I look for are the patterns in the landscape. The next thing I look for are the plants. And I ask the plants, so what are you telling me? What are you telling me about this landscape? The first thing that I saw with that one is it pretty much had the same plants everywhere. And there were only a couple of species, which told me that that landscape was very simplified, not that much different to your corn crop, albeit it wasn't a human-planted crop. It was just grasslands, but the grasslands, through management, had become sterile. So they were just like your corn crop and about as functional. So they're the things that we look at. Okay, how did the water move over the landscape? How is it now moving? And that's it. That's what my starting point. And then ask the plants. If the plants tell me, actually, there's very low fertility in this landscape. So I've got to look to, well, how, working with water, how do I start to rebuild the fertility? What plants do I need in here to rebuild the fertility? So the rainforest, or the likes of a forest, builds fertility. And then you've got the lower species of plants, the plants down on the ground level, that utilize the fertility built by the rainforest. Yeah. So if you say, well, I'm just down to a very simplified grassland, what other plants can I add into the system to start that rebuild of the fertility so that I can change from just this grass to, a multitude of different species of plants? And you've got to get the right management strategy to be able to achieve that. And it takes time. It could take, every landscape's going to be different, but it could be anywhere from 2 to 5 years, and you'll see a massive change. And all we've got to do is stop fighting the landscape. And, if we stop fighting it, then we're going to be miles in front.
Right. So I just want to clarify for our viewers and just review in my very much layman's terms, the core building blocks. The first two are slow the flow. In other words, enable the landscape to capture and hold water. And in the process of doing that, you're letting all plants grow because those plants are then creating the fertility required to begin to regenerate that landscape. Is that more or less correct?
So your aim is to help the landscape retain water. Yep. So it's not necessarily hold it, I guess. It's retain water in the soil. Not people think, let's go and build some big dams all around the place. No. Because that's not how the landscape evolved with big dams. It was holding most of its water in the soil profile, in the aquifers, and so forth. So you have to look at retaining that. Let all plants grow is about enabling the small water cycle to get that going, because that's the key, because that's the small water cycle is what keeps the moisture coming. So we get that going. So we need every green growing plant that we can possibly have to try and get that system working. That enables us to build the fertility to then be able to, grow a higher order plant, say. And then it's about how do you go about setting that up? Because, a lot of these plants are, a farmer or a landscape manager would call weeds. Some of these plants you would determine as weeds. And a weed is just a plant that you don't want on your place. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it's one that you don't want. So, if you were a cropping farmer, say you're a cropping farmer in Australia, and you had a plant called ryegrass. It's a grass. It's a very high fertility grass. If you had ryegrass in your cropping land, you would call that a weed. But if a dairy farmer or a beef farmer had ryegrass, he would consider it a beautiful pasture for his animals. See, one plant for one is an enemy, the other plant for the other person is a good plant. So every plant differs. But what we've got to look at are the characteristics of the plant and how much green surface area does it have, because the more green surface area it has, the faster it rebuilds your landscape.
And weeds, because they tend to grow so quickly, and compared to the amount of space that they take up when they're going in the ground, they have a lot of green space. They're actually helpful, at least in the initial stages of this process, correct?
Well, yeah. Well, so I think if I try to get people to, when we're out in the paddock, say, righto, pretend you're an ant. And you're an ant, and you've come walking along the ground, and you've come up to a thistle. I'm assuming you guys know what a thistle is, yeah? So you've walked up to a thistle and you look at it. What does it look like to the ant? Looks like a tree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. So if a thistle takes about 3 to 4 months to grow right through its cycle before it dies, you've now got a tree operating in that landscape over 4 months. Now, to achieve the same thing with a tree, it's going to take 30 to 50 years. And the tree will never return all of its mass. Whatever it takes to grow the thistle, whatever fertility, whatever moisture, all returns back to the soil surface when the plant dies. Yep. The tree will maintain a portion of that within itself. Now, that's fine, but it means that if you rely on trees alone to rebuild the landscape, we must be prepared to wait 30 to 50 years to achieve it. A tree drops about 7% of its mass every year. So that's how much leaf matter or timber or whatever it's returning to the landscape every year. But it will take 50 years before the tree has enough mass that it's really dropping anything of great use. So in the short term, they're not our solution. They must be the solution as well, but they're our long game. They're not our short game. What plants do we require for the short game? And the landscape throws all of these plants at us that we call weeds, because the landscape is playing the short game and the long game. And so we must replicate what the landscape's trying to do, what nature is trying to do. Nature will just throw whatever plants it can at a problem to fix it, because it knows that the one thing that it requires is a covering of green material over the land's surface. End of story.
And can you explain very briefly to the viewers how that impacts or creates the small water cycle and what exactly the small water cycle is and how that benefits a landscape?
Yeah, sure. So the plants are utilizing what moisture they have available to them in the soil. Through photosynthesis, they uptake the water out of the soil and they evapotranspire it out through their leaves through photosynthesis. When they are going through that process, they are converting a liquid, as in liquid water, into a gas. At the same time as doing that, they trap heat, which means now you've got heat, which is energy. They got heat and water together. And we all know that hot air rises, doesn't it? So as the plant is going through the process of photosynthesis and evapotranspiring this water, it rises because it's getting hot. So it rises up, which creates cool, which is why when you stand under a tree on a hot day, it's cooler than standing in the sun. Yep. So what's happening is that warm, moist air rises up into the atmosphere, and when the sun goes down or the heat goes out of the day, because the plants are moderating the landscape, they're cooling it during the day, they then attract, because the warm, moist air sits up here, warm air always moves to a cool mass. So the ground is now cooler than the air up in the atmosphere. So that warm air then settles back down to the cool. It then converts from a gas back to a liquid and returns the moisture that it used during the day back onto the leaves of the plants. You see it in the morning when you get out of bed as a dew or a fog or a mist. That is a small water cycle. That is what is missing in most landscapes. That doesn't function anymore.
And weeds. Go ahead.
The more plants we remove, the less it works.
So in this case, when you're talking about, as I've heard you and your father and others talk about a shift in mindset, you all often refer to weeds as, you're flipping it 180 degrees and calling them primary colonizers of a landscape because they are so quick growing, because they do tend to be so hardy. They're from what I understand, frequently your best tool for restoring that daily water cycle.
Well, they're going to respond to the conditions of the landscape. It's like I said, like I explained with the desert. We can go out to the desert. If you've got water and you've got fertilizer, you could grow a crop for an amount of time, but you won't reinstate the small water cycle because those plants don't fit in the landscape without all those other components. Yeah. Where you could go out into the same desert and have a cactus growing, and that cactus will be able to carry out those processes and needs none of the extra components. Yeah. But we consider the cactus to be an enemy. But no, it's just able to evolve and live in that landscape. So if we understand it's going to be carrying out these processes, it's going to be helping to build the landscape. It just so happens that that particular plant is very slow. So, if we can, if we get some of these plants that we deem as weeds with a bigger green surface area operating, then all of a sudden we change that situation around without the required inputs. But see, most of our landscapes that are dysfunctional, in other words, they don't have enough plants in it, the water runs away. It's not that there's a deficiency of water, it's there's no effective rainfall. The rainfall that falls runs away. So you must start with water. You must start with managing water first. If you can manage the water and hold it for long enough in the landscape to start vegetation growth, then everything just explodes from there.
And what are some of the basic strategies in natural sequence farming and related practices to begin to slow that flow of the water?
Yeah, so small earthworks, really. I mean, it has to be. Everything must be done. I imagine that every landscape I'm going to go into is highly degraded. Now, of course, they're not all highly degraded, but there's always degrees of degradation. But if I was to assume that they were highly degraded, then the person that's going to be stewarding that landscape are probably not going to look at returning much income in the short term. So therefore, whatever work we do, it must be very, very affordable. If we go in there and think that we're going to have millions of dollars, we're not going to have that. So we've got to do everything at a minuscule amount. And it's all going to be determined by the amount of money available. So we would look at putting in what we call contours, but little check banks that can help manage the water until we can get plants in the system. So if they can slow the speed that the water leaves the landscape, and we know that water always moves to the low point. If for your viewers, I'm not sure where your viewers are or will be, but let's assume that they're in urban settings where they're not out in landscapes, so they don't understand landscapes. But what you do have are roads and gutters, don't you? So you have concrete gutters. Well, if you go out into the street after a rain event and look to see what has happened in the gutters, you will find that in the gutter there'll be components where leaves have captured, and then sediment has built up behind those leaves, and a pond is formed. And so what nature is trying to do is actually trying to build a contour in the drain that the human built to get rid of the water. And the landscape is nature is trying to reverse the dumb human to stop the water from flowing away. So it creates these little check banks so that the water starts ponding. You guys have got beavers in parts of your country and now starting to reintroduce in Europe. Beavers that did exactly that job. They would create these ponds which slowed the speed that the water moved. Now, what happens in Australia, because we didn't have beavers, but we had the landscape would start to create these patterns of deposition, and plants would grow in that, because we had cycles where there was water and then there was no water, no water. So when there's water, it's harder for a lot of plants to grow. But because it's water, then no water, plants could then start colonizing the areas where the silt was deposited, just like in the gutter. Yeah, the gutter's a simple example of how the broader landscape works. It's no different. Nature does the same thing everywhere. Never does it do it any different. It's always the same. which is why we look at the water patterns when we go out into a landscape. So where the sediment deposits, next thing that happens as soon as the water stops is plants start growing out of the sediment. So the next time it rains and next time there's a water flow, the plants now manage how the water moves. And every time the plants, because there's now plants there, the original silt can't be washed away and more silt captures. And every time the silt gets there, it grows higher and higher, and then the water moves further and further. Next thing you know, the water that used to run in the gutter is now running on the road. And what happens next? Whoever your local road authorities come through and sweep all of the silt away and get it running back in the gutter again. That's what farmers do. And farmers have done exactly the same thing. As soon as the water starts ponding on their landscape, oh, that's no good. Got to get rid of that. Move the whatever the block is, get rid of the water.
So it's almost the exact opposite of what they ought to be doing.
It's exactly the opposite. I say to people, if you wake up in the morning and you go, gee, I got a really good idea what I can do out in nature, you probably should do the opposite, because whatever you came up with will be the reverse to what nature would actually do. And there's your secret. Whatever you think is the right thing to do the opposite. And that'll be the right thing.
Yeah, and you touched on an interesting point, Stuart, about the dams that are often created with intentionality to improve farming or make water more accessible. But I get the impression on a biomolecular level, the way the water flows over rocks naturally and not damming it up, also there are mineral components that plants can utilize through their life processes.
Exactly, because what happens is that if you understand that a landscape builds from the top to the bottom, it can't build from the bottom to the bottom to the top. It must build from the top to the bottom, and this is a key difference in Australia compared to, say, the Americas or Africa, is that you had high mountain ranges with a snow or ice and then a melt, which meant that the landscape would drop a huge amount of biomass leading into snowfall. The biomass would then be captured under the snow. It would break down slowly. The snow would start to melt, which would then release both water and nutrients over the landscape, just like you're talking about, Dante, at the same time that plants started growing. So now the plants could grab the water and the nutrients as it moved past. Yeah, simple as that. Australia didn't have that. Australia has not had that since it separated from Antarctica as part of Gondwana land. So it had to evolve a different method. And so the method it evolved was, rather than saying, well, everything's going to move from the mountain through snow melt, it created wetlands everywhere. So wetlands are now the top of the hill. So the wetlands would do the processing of the nutrients, and every time there was the next rain event, it would spread that fertility out over the landscape and feed it with both nutrients and water. But of course, we humans came here and decided that those wetlands were a prime place to grow crops. So we drained the water away and grew crops, which meant we sped up the movement of the fertility to the ocean. And I'm sure the same thing has happened in America, everywhere, all around the world. I mean, that's why we now have deserts where there used to be food bowls. And it was all destroyed by exactly the same tool that you can use to fix it: water. So those landscapes, they introduced irrigation and they flushed all of their fertility away. They flushed their fertility away to the point that they could no longer grow plants, and it converted to being a desert. And
so,
we're doing that.
So the critical component being water, that doubles back on what you often say, which is that NSF will work anywhere it rains because water moves according to the same laws of physics.
Everywhere. Everywhere is the same. And nature, what nature's trying to do is stop water moving to the ocean fast. So what it does is it manages the speed of which water goes from the land to the ocean. Yep. And it does it by creating barriers in its way. So it drops silt. And it's difficult to imagine because all of this stuff happens over a long period of time. And we don't get to be on the planet individually for very long compared to how long nature can take to do this stuff. But nature would, every time it starts to create drop sediment, it raises the water level. And then it drops a bit more sediment, which raises the water level. Every time it raises the water level, the water can spread further out, which is why we have floodplains. You would have floodplains over there, the same. And because the water, as soon as the water gets restricted, like in the gutter, the water level rises, and next thing the water's running on the road or across the landscape. That's exactly what nature's trying to do. We've just got to stop undoing that.
So what is the mindset shift, or maybe mindset shifts, plural, that you feel need to be made for people to really begin to embrace things like natural sequence farming on a global basis, potentially? What ways do we need to begin to look at things differently in order to realize that approaches like this, working with nature, are better for the planet, better for the food supply, and therefore better for us? What is that mindset shift that you think needs to happen?
You, Dante, and every other person that lives in towns and cities that's not a farmer. You are the only way this is ever going to happen. And see, this is the problem. You've got consumers out there demanding cheap food. Cheap food comes at a cost, and it comes at a cost to the landscape. So demanding cheap food always comes at a cost to something. Something has to pay. There's no such thing as cheap food. You're just not going to be able to get food, cheaply everywhere, because you've got all these other costs and moving it around and so forth. So consumers, if they understand that by demanding cheap food, it's going to come at the expense of something. It either comes at the expense of the landscape or the expense of the farmer farming the landscape, one or the other. Humans being humans, a farmer can't continue to farm and go broke. The two things don't work. You don't get to stay there doing that. So therefore, they are forced then to make the land give more than maybe it's capable of giving, so that they can get enough of a return to continue doing what they're doing. So the consumer can demand a better quality product and be prepared to pay a slightly higher price for it. Yep. That's the way. I mean, there may be a different way to achieve it, but at the end, the consumer must be the one that drives it. So getting consumers to understand that landscape, the ability of the landscape to be managed is on them, not on the farmer. See, a farmer is out there producing food. They're doing the best they can to produce food. Yep. Now, their circumstance determines how they produce it. So if they can understand, if the consumer understands the farmer's viewpoint, and the consumer says, well, what I would like is I would like to know that you are looking after your landscape and regenerating it and building it. And as a result, I'm going to help you do that by paying you a fairer price for your food, for what you produce. And all of a sudden, you start to encourage a farmer to farm differently. Yep. Because it's like any business. If you have a business and the business is driven by what the products you're selling, if the consumer doesn't like your products, they won't buy your products. Therefore, you will then start stocking products that the consumer wants to buy, won't you? It's no different with farming. The farmer will produce the products the consumer demands. They're not going to keep producing something the consumer doesn't want. But because the farmers are there's a small number of farmers, and most food is sold through a retail outlet, through shopping centers and whatever, the shopping centre or those guys demand and set the prices. Well, the consumer has to say, well, you can set the price however you like. I'm not paying. I don't want to buy that product. I want to buy this product. Well, the stores that currently probably stock majority crap food that is cheap to produce, if the consumer stops buying it, the store will start stocking what they're buying or want to buy. It's just business. This is not difficult to work out, but it'll never happen if you rely on the supermarkets or the stores to change. The consumer must be the ones that to create the change.
I mean, this is where I start to rant, because I cannot think of anything more important to one's survival on planet Earth than food. So why aren't we as a society just prioritizing that? A, more respect to farmers, which is the foundational aspect of all this. And B, what you just said, Stuart, quality food.
I think the main reason is the consumers don't know. They don't know that, one, they don't know. I mean, case in point, your recent election, like it or not, your recent election was watched around the world. I've been watching that intently for a long time, far longer than I should have been, because I'm not in America and I have no relationship with it. But that shows the consumers, the average voter, actually starting to pay attention to the bullshit that's out there. Yeah, and they said, yes, okay, we can see some of that bullshit, and we're not doing that anymore. We're going to do something that's different. We don't necessarily know that it's right or that it's going to be better, but we're tired of this bullshit, and so we're going to do something different. And that's what it takes. That's what it takes. It takes for society to wake up. My concern is that usually for change to happen, it has to be disastrous. Because usually humans only act when it's almost too late. Yeah. So I don't know how we really get the people to change before we get to that point. I believe we can. I think, which is why I was paying so much attention to your elections, that I believe that the people you have in charge over there now will create change. Now, will all of that change be positive? I don't know, but I'm sure some of it will be. The one thing it will be is change. And change you need. If you don't have change, is your forest. That's change, because you got diversity. What you had before was the corn crop. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely it makes sense.
Everything the same. So your monoculture corn crop was what you had going on in your country and ours, and every other country probably throughout the world. We got the corn crop. What we need is the rainforest. We need diversity. And what you've got going on over there now, I'm very hopeful will drive what's going to happen here. This could be a big point of change. I don't know. Could be a big point in change for the entire world. Remains to be seen.
You hit on an interesting point, Bart, and again, we come back to this whole concept of mindset, which is integral to change. And I'm curious, Stuart, because, and this is a little bit changing the subject, speaking of change, but, when you teach other farmers, there's got to be a mindset shift, doesn't there, from previous practice for a lot of them? And I'm just curious, why are some people resistant to adopting natural sequence farming? The few that are, I would assume the majority have embraced it. But I'm curious, why? Yeah. What's their rationale?
No, you'd be wrong at the majority. It's very much a minority. Very much a minority. Yeah, very much. What prevents change? Well, consistency, I guess. The corn crop is consistent. You know that if you put 100 kilos of fertilizer under it this year, maybe next year you have to put 120, the year after you have to put 150, but they know that if they keep doing that, they can grow that crop. That returns X amount of dollars. And so as soon as, if you start to think you want to move away from that, it's fear. It's fear that it won't work. You think about it, in your community, get out of farming. You want to do something that's different. What's the first thing your friends say? Oh, geez, that's a bit strange. And they say, oh, geez, you're a weirdo.
Right.
And all of a sudden,
and that's risky. And that's risky. They'll throw the fear element.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, holy schmoly, we only need to look at the last few years of the result of fear. The result of fear drove people to do things that on a normal level they probably would never have done. So fear is a big element. It's a big part of our process that we deal with every day. So fear of change, because things might not work, is a key reason why people or farmers, land managers, don't change. The thing that makes them change, two things. Usually it's one, there might be some form of ill health in their family or themselves, or financial instability. Because they were growing the corn crop and they started putting on 100 kilos of fertilizer, now they're up to 500 kilos of fertilizer. When they were putting on 100 kilos of fertilizer, that cost them $10. They're now putting on 500 kilos of fertilizer, and that costs them $2,000, and the crop makes 2001. So all of a sudden now we go, holy shit, well, who's making all the money out of this? I'm working every day, and who's making the money? Fertilizer salesman, the chemical salesman, and the guy who gets the end product, the corn, and I make nothing. All I do is just keep doing the same stuff over and over and go nowhere. I must change. So they're the two mental things that I see predominantly are a reason why people change. There are a very, very small minority that change because they understand that they're harming their landscape and they want to genuinely do a better job of their landscape. At this stage, they are the minority. The numbers are, to get change, you have to reach 20% of the population. So 20% of farmers doing things differently means that the other 80% will start doing things differently. But until you get to 20%, you can't achieve it.
Well, and then if you don't have, as you say, the public demand that would support that shift in agriculture, even if you do have 20% of farmers, if you don't have the public education, it doesn't matter, which actually is interesting because that, when I'm thinking about what you're saying, that it really comes down to the consumer, it's a public awareness or public education that needs to happen. And an interesting concept that I learned in a copywriting course I took a few years back was that when you're looking at something, say you're looking online and you want to buy, maybe it's a workout program or something like that, they will tell you what the features are of that workout program. But what really gets you is the transformation. It's seeing the person who weighed 289 pounds, and now you see a picture of them happy, hearty, healthy, and hale at 165 pounds. In other words, people don't buy features, they buy transformation. And that brings me to my question of, it would seem to me that part of that public education would be to show people a picture, to paint for people a picture of what that transformation could be. So if you're learning that natural sequence farming, I'm looking through my notes here, how it applies to the food chain, how it applies to human health, how it applies to the environment, global warming, in light of the forest fires in California, its fire mitigation properties. I'm thinking that all of those practical impacts of something like NSF, if you paint a picture of the transformation that can happen as a consequence, maybe that could help with that public education. What do you think?
Yeah, because we're humans are visual beings.
Mm-hmm.
If we can see something and it makes sense, then, well, it doesn't even have to make sense really. Sometimes if we look at it, we think it looks like it's okay. Well, then we do it. Whether it makes sense or not, it's probably not necessarily the case. But either way, yes, we are very, very visual, and so we see the person that's now got a six-pack and used to have a keg. So they've gone from having the keg to the six-pack. Go, oh, I want that, and so you want the six-pack. The only downside is, of course, that you realise there's a considerable amount of stuff in between. And it's doing the stuff in between that gets you to the six-pack, which seems to be the problem. Yeah,
Right.
but certainly the visuals. I know what you're getting at. So we're about to go in February. We're about to start to travel around places in Australia that have done this work to make up a documentary to show people that have done the work and some of the results they've had for that exact purpose. So that people can see, I could see that one, yes, it makes a change, but two, I could do that. That's not hard. That's actually very easy because that guy is just a farmer like me, and he did that himself. He didn't rely on government. He didn't rely on anybody else to actually get him to do that. He didn't even rely on the consumer because he could still continue on his production system because this doesn't cost a lot of money to do. So you can achieve it. That's the idea of that. It's pretty expensive to get it done, but I think it's necessary just for
Definitely.
Definitely.
Well, I mean, that's how it caught my attention when I first saw. Our viewers won't know this. At least those outside of Australia won't know that there is a weekly news program in Australia called Australian Story, similar to what Nightline or 2020 used to be in the United States. And Stuart, his father Peter, who was the creator of natural sequence farming, their family was covered on an episode of Australian Story, and it's actually the most popular feature in that. Yeah, it's the most popular episode. It's got something like 3 million views on YouTube. And I'll be perfectly honest, it was those before and after images shown in that documentary. It was the aerial footage of, I don't know if it was the property at Bylong or where it was, but where you see very clearly the green area that's been treated with natural sequence farming, and you see the neighboring paddocks, which are all, run according to more traditional agriculture. You see them brown. That transformation, to physically be able to see that is pretty impactful. So I think it's great that you guys are going around and doing this.
I'll tell you, 2019 here was a very dry time, particularly in southern Australia, in some of the southern states. And I was flying from Tasmania, which is way down in the south, back up to Queensland in the north. And I was flying past, and I'm just looking at as I do, if I can get a window seat, I'm always looking at the features on the ground because I can see all of these water patterns that I'm talking about, except they're in larger scale. So I'm looking at the bigger landscape pictures rather than when I walk onto a piece of land, I'm looking at the same patterns, but they're smaller. Anyway, we're flying over. I'm thinking, gee, I think I know that. I know that town. Yeah, that looks like that town. I go along. So Bylong will be here somewhere, which is our old farm, Tarwin Park. And I'm looking. because I know that landscape like the back of my hand. I'm looking, going, yeah, that's the features. There it is. And I could see Tarwin Park standing out because it was dry. It was the only part that was green. The only part that was green. And this was at 30,000 feet. So it's not, looking at it from close. It's from 30,000 feet it stood out. So that's those sort of things show you if it's green when nothing else is, then it's functional. And that's all we're looking at. We're looking at functionality. If it's green, it's functioning. If it's not green, it's not functioning.
Yeah, and that vision of Tarwin Park, Stuart, is so impactful the way you described it right there. I'm curious, like in your teaching, what has been a memorable moment from one of your students where they said, wow, when I took your course, I was blown away, and this is what happened to my farm. Do you have any memories of that from any of your students?
all the time. But I mean,
Yeah.
what surprises me are the things that they're blown away by, which I just go, how could you not have understood that? I mean, it's freaking not rocket science. This was simple. How could that be so surprising to you? But they all go, my God, I can, all this water that I can now manage easily. That water used to run away where I would have a rain event and the next day the water was gone and the landscape was dry again. I've now got water. It's flowing here. It's been flowing for weeks. That sort of stuff. And as soon as you can do that, then all of a sudden you get the plant growth associated with it, and that's the start of the process. The thing is that if you understand the landscape and you get these components back in, it all does it by itself. You do not need to keep going out doing things. You just got to not undo it, and it will just build all by itself.
You
like
catalyze it. Yeah.
Always go back to the rainforest as your example. Did a human build the rainforest? No, they didn't. So therefore, how did it build? Copy that. Repeat that. Not building the rainforest as such, but understand the processes that go into a rainforest and recreate the processes on a landscape. And it's as simple as that.
So as part of what we're trying to do here with this podcast, it is sort of by definition with the various people that we're speaking with and will be speaking with, it is obviously a public education campaign. So in terms of practical impacts, like Dante was just saying in relation to some of the farmers you worked with, what are, even if it's just providing us with a little bit of a thumbnail, what are some of the practical positive impacts of a process like natural sequence farming for the food supply chain, for human health, the environment, global warming, forest fire mitigation, some of these things? What is the positive practical impact of that practice and related practices?
Well, I mean, it's about being able to green up more of the earth and hold it green for longer. If we can maintain more green over a greater area, then we have a massive impact on the climate, or at least the climate closest to Earth where we're sitting, closest to the land where we're sitting, by reinstating the small water cycle. So green plants are the solution, but green plants can't grow without water. So if we can manage the water so that we've got water in the soil that grows green plants, the green plants do everything else. They do that all by themselves. The trick is, how do we incorporate farming within that system? That's the trick, because we need to have more of the earth green for longer and less not green. So how do we set it up? We have to understand how the landscape builds. It always builds from a high point to a low point. So if we reintroduce this into our landscape, if we have areas where we have trees or green plants across the landscape, then below that we grow our crop. And then we repeat it. Another area. So if we had, let's say, for instance, it wouldn't be a rainforest, but let's say it's a forest. We're 50 years down the track and we've got our landscape broken up across the slope with all of these forests, then cropping land, forest, cropping land, forest, cropping land. And however you grow the crops, doesn't matter whether you're choosing to use chemicals or not use chemicals, that's beside the point. We've got a setup where we're during the time that we're not growing a crop, we've got green in that landscape. If we can maintain a minimum of 30% green cover all year round, all of the scenarios you talked about go. They're all gone. So let's go to the fires, the recent fires you've had in LA.
I was just about to bring that up, so I'm glad that you're going there.
Right? So in the landscape that feeds those fires, it was arid and dry. So what you've got out there is you've got this massive pocket of heat. What does hot air do? Hot air rises. As a result, it creates wind. The wind that comes in is what fans the fires. I'm assuming there's a big percentage of that vegetation around those areas is highly flammable, right? So you've got an incendiary sitting there waiting And then you've got something that fuels the fire when it starts. So whether it starts by human hand or natural, it's irrelevant. It's going to start at some point. What you can do is you can manage the thing that feeds it. And that is the hot air mass that sits out over the dry landscape that creates the winds that feeds the fire. There's your problem.
Well, and also just to tack on to that, I'm assuming that the more hydrated your landscape is, the more moisture you're going to have in those trees. And so these events could either be, maybe in some cases, prevented entirely, or at least the severity of the damage could be greatly mitigated if that environment were properly hydrated, such that these trees were holding moisture and making it more flame retardant.
I don't know that landscape. Do you have a lot of eucalypts in that area now, or are they predominantly pine?
We don't have a lot of eucalypts in that area, but it is very dry, scrubby. Let's put it this way: it's the kind of stuff you would expect to burn. You don't need to be an expert at all to realize, oh, that's going to burn well. Let's put it this way: there's a reason why we had those forest fires in California and not here in Illinois, and it's the vegetation.
So right, but it still stems from the broader part of the landscape that's hot. See, because the broader part of the landscape that's hot prevents the rain falling where the forest is, where it was what it should do. See, the rain should fall where the forest is, which then maintains the moisture. It's very hard to change the forest that burns because generally it's quite inaccessible. It's usually steep country. So, to get into there, it requires a degree of complexity. It's not impossible. Of course, you can do it, but the cost starts to rise. But you can do it. But the bigger impact is on the broader part of the landscape where you can work. If you can cool that, then it creates the enough moisture that keeps the forest wet, and it's an ever compounding action. But if you don't cool that area first, you're not going to get the rain falling on the forest. Once you do that, then the forest, yes, for a big portion of its time, will be wetter rather than drier. But in the periods where it does actually get dry, because there will be periods where it gets dry, you must, if you're managing the landscape where you can maintain green, then the fires are never as bad as what they are or have been. And, from what I can understand, that particular area has been dehydrated over many years of farming practices, have created water runoff and not water holding, and more of the landscape arid, like Australia, not growing green vegetation, and less time where it actually grew something green. So your solution, as humans, how we act is, in the instance of those fires, the experts will be focusing on what they can do where the fire was. And of course, that isn't where the problem is. And humans only ever focus on symptoms. They never actually focus on the cause. So, not to espouse doctors, but if you go to the doctor and you say, I've got this wrong with me, you want an immediate fix. So the doctor can only give you what you want, an immediate fix. So that might be a medication or something. He says, right, you have this medication and that will fix you. But if whatever the symptom you have is as a result of the fact that you eat shit food, the only solution for you long term is actually to stop eating shit food. The doctor will give you something to treat the symptom, but it's not going to stop it from coming back again. But that's what we do as humans. We are rushing to treat symptoms rather than treat causes. So if we say, well, righto, the cause is the fact that all of this landscape out here drives the weather over here, we must treat the landscape there. And then we solve.
You're hitting on such a salient point, Stuart, because I grew up in Southern California, and there's an area there you may be familiar with called the Imperial Valley. in North America, that's one of the most productive agricultural areas. However, it gets back to what you said, Stuart. It's been mismanaged through this weird, bizarre series of canals, and it's in serious danger from the Santa Ana winds because it's adjacent to where those fires are occurring. So, I mean, if we don't manage that kind of on a world level through common sense management of the land, as you've espoused, Stuart, it's an issue. So I'm just curious, when the world's food supply is at stake, I mean, it seems to me that natural sequence farming plays a really important role in feeding this population that is going to grow exponentially in the future. What are your thoughts on that population growth and the role of natural sequence farming?
Oh, I think it's massive. I think if we don't start paying attention to how the landscape functions, we're screwed. Population control will be solved really quickly because there'll be people starving everywhere. And that is going to happen if we continue on the path we're at. I mean, some people say that, by 2050, we've reached crisis point. I don't know what the time frame is. I don't know whether it's that soon or not.
No one does.
That's right. It's a bit of fear factor stuff. I'm not into fear. I'm into looking at, well, there is a problem. What's the solution? That's another thing. Everyone talks about problems. We want, this is a problem, that's a problem. No one has bloody solutions. NSF is a solution. We're not interested in fear. We're not interested in anything else. We're interested in solutions. And NSF that I see is your starting component. It's not all of it. And this frustrates me a little bit, that you hear people saying and talking about stuff like they have the only solution. This thing, we can go out there and we can manage our grazing and repair the whole landscape. No, that's one tool. We need every tool available at our disposal to get this system working. But if we start with what we're talking about, NSF, where we're looking at the landscape, getting the landscape to function, then we can start introducing all the other tools in there to make this system work. We need all of the tools. And you've got to be careful how you use the tool. I'll give an example. Let's say we take a hammer. Now, a hammer, we can drive a nail in to a piece of wood to hold the piece of wood to another piece of wood. Yep. But we can use the same hammer to break the wall down. Exactly the same tool used in two different ways. So you've got to be careful how you use the tool. And that's the problem. We have used the tools available to us, like the hammer breaking down the wall, rather than the hammer driving the nail in. We need to get back to using our tools where we're just using the tool to do only the component that tool should do and not everything. So the canals, I don't know the system, Dante, there, but my guess is they're using the tool of managing water to supposedly or hopefully do something positive, where in actual fact, without understanding the landscape function, they made it worse, not better. But they still.
I don't want to, adjudicate them here, because I don't have knowledge of what the intent was, but I just know that whole area is in serious danger, and it's critical to North American produce. So we'll see.
Yeah, everywhere's the same. And look, it's all repairable. But my belief is that NSF is the starting point, and from there we move up. We add in all the tools, and we can create our production systems. But first of all, we have to add our production systems where they're suitable to the landscape at this point in time. At this point in time, if it's not suitable for growing your corn crop, then it shouldn't be bloody well growing the corn crop. Yep.
Well, doesn't that, what you just said about using all of these different tools, that by extension is basically the same principle when you're comparing and contrasting a rainforest with a monoculture of corn, which we have here in northern Illinois. In other words, it's not just diversity in the landscape, it's diversity in thought, it's diversity in approaches. And I don't like to use the term diversity because it has so many other connotations, but for want of a better term, diversity in numerous things. It's not just NSF. I mean, I look at what Martin Royds is doing, and you know far better than I do. He's using a lot of different approaches. So he's using all of these tools. So it's almost like you don't want to have a monoculture in anything, be it in thought, be it in action, be it in a landscape.
Be it in people.
Absolutely.
It's always, amuses me that for whatever reason, being racist to somebody who is different to you is wrong, but we're allowed to be racist to plants. Yeah. So we are allowed to say, well, we're only going to grow the corn crop. We can't grow anything else. Can't have anything else there. No. Well, that's racism to plants. That's being racist to plants. So all we need to use is the same thought that we use amongst humans out in our landscape. And diversity is key. There's no harm in saying diversity. Diversity is key in everything. Diversity is key in business. It's key in life. It's key in farming, everywhere. Diversity is the key. That is the secret. With diversity, we can survive. Without it, we die.
And it comes back to what you were saying about treating root causes rather than symptoms, because you were going on about something that I've been harping on about for years and years and years. And I had a really interesting example of that when some years back I was dealing with some health issues, in fact, some mental health issues, to be honest. And I went to local psychiatric clinic and they gave me, I wasn't in the doctor's office 25 seconds, I'm not exaggerating, before he just handed me a script for some pharmaceutical. I took it, it made me feel awful. And because I live in Chicago, we've got a decent little Chinatown in the city. And I thought, I'm going to go there. I want to see about this traditional Chinese medicine. Not only did it work better, but the entire ethos and mentality of their approach could not have been more different. Whereas the Western medicine was just treating the symptom, they actually weren't the Chinese doctors. And I literally had to have an interpreter. That's how authentic this was. Their whole concept in traditional Chinese medicine is about root causes. It's about balance. It's about balance and blending of healthy energies in the body, which is a completely different paradigm in terms of looking at and analyzing and coming up with solutions for anything. So for me, that was a very profound example of that probably in the long run, you probably save more time, more energy, and more aggravation by doing a bit more heavy lifting on the front end to address root causes, rather than continually throwing money to put Band-Aids on top of forest fires in California, for example.
Exactly. I mean, it hasn't been a solution any time in the past, and it's not going to be a solution into the future. We must start treating root causes. We solve the root causes and all of the problems start to disappear.
But doesn't that come back to something that, and I've certainly noticed it in myself and others as well, it's a bizarre trait of the human mind that when we are doing something and it's not working, very rarely do we look at what it is that we're doing. We convince ourselves, no, maybe I just need to double up and I need to do even more of it and I need to do it even harder, when in fact it's the approach itself that's faulty. And by doing more of it and by doing it harder, you're actually making the problem worse.
Yeah, it's no different to the example I gave with the tool. You could use the tool for good or you can use the tool for harm. So if you're doing something, you think that doing more of it, you use the tool more, it's going to work better. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Either the tool works or it doesn't work. End of story. But that's, and that we have to realize, humans must realize that that's our frailty. We use a term, a silver bullet. Every person out there is looking for a silver bullet. And they're going to keep looking for the rest of their life, and they're never going to find it because there's no such thing. Everything is holistic. There's a whole lot of components that make you, a whole lot of components that make the universe around you. And that's how we need to focus. But of course, it's so difficult to do that. It's difficult to look at. So we look at little components. This is the thing I see with science in relation to landscapes is we try to use science to determine how a landscape functions, but science doesn't have the capacity to do it because there's so many components. You need so many different scientific practitioners to actually put a landscape together. And it's impossible. That just can't work. So because one person will pull out a component of the landscape and study that, and another person will pull out another component, but those people generally can't communicate or understand how the two bits fit together. We have to have a different view. Your body, when you had issues with your mental health, I'll guarantee you what you were stuffing in your mouth was a major cause for what was creating the mental instability, because your body was not in a comfortable state internally for you to manage your mind. I mean, external factors, of course, they're all going to be there, but you face it all the time anyway.
Yeah.
And drugs are not going to fix it. All they do is mask it. That's all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what do you think then, given that NSF and other tools in the toolbox, as you would say it, given that they are so replicable globally, where do you go from here? Where do we go from here? I mean, I'm talking right now with some of the governmental ministries in Costa Rica about getting a large-scale positive development project going down there, hopefully with, you, Martin, your father, other people, experts in this, to put these practices into place there. Where do you think we can go and what we can do, not just the general public and our viewers, but people like us who are also working in this space? What can we do to begin to foster that kind of global replicability of these kinds of practices?
Well, look, you can work at that level. We've had this discussion a number of times about things that you've been trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I do not believe that this is a top-down approach. This must be a bottom-up approach. The way most things that are successful that happen are a bottom-up approach, never a top-down approach. See, the trouble with the top-down approach, working with governments and so forth, is there's always degrees of, I would just label it corruption. It may not, but improprieties where there's a lot of money at stake and a lot of money changing hands, which then distorts what actually happens on the ground. I still think that everything must be driven from the bottom up. And going back to your political system over there, it does appear that switch is mildly starting to happen, where they're focusing, or they're saying that they're going to focus a little bit more on a bottom-up approach, where they're saying, let's look at health. Let's look at the food that we're producing and how we're producing it. So that's more of a bottom-up approach. I wouldn't say don't work from the top down, because I think you need to do both, but there will always be more longer-lasting success if we work from the bottom up. So that's really, I still go back that the people who are most affected, whether they're affected by food, whether they're affected by climate, the majority are the consumers. The majority are not the people at the top. So do they really care that much? Probably not. The people who are affected are going to care the most, and they're the people like us, the average punters out there. We're the ones that are affected, so we're the ones that should be most concerned. So getting us to realize that, one, maybe we should be concerned, and two, there is something we can do. Most people will say, oh, look, I understand that, but what can I do? Showing them that there is something that they can do, that's key. Because as soon as someone's got an ability to do something, then we've got action. Stuff.
Mm.
And the easiest thing for people to do, and for me, what I focus on is eliminating people's ability to make excuses. People recognize, there's a problem. There is a problem with climate, but what can I do? There's nothing I can do. Well, yes, you can, because how you purchase your food, how you live your life determines how everything else happens. So you can make a difference. Stop making excuses. There's a solution. You do that. Even if that's all you do. As simple as, why don't you grow a tree in your backyard instead of having it paved? Why don't you grow some veggies in your backyard instead of relying on the store? All of these things you can do, all of those play a role in how our landscape and our climate and our food system works. So there aren't any excuses. We can all make excuses because it's much easier to make excuses because inherently we probably are a little bit lazy and we don't really want to do anything. But then we want to complain all the time about how bad everything is, but do nothing about it. These are hard messages, but they're essential.
Yeah, that brings to mind that Margaret Mead quote that don't underestimate, I'm going to totally misquote it now, but don't underestimate the power of a few dedicated individuals to change the world. Indeed, that's the only group that ever has.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Doesn't matter. Sounds all right to me, Dante.
Yeah, I think that was pretty close.
It's a wild guess.
Yeah. But yes, you're right, Stuart. You and I have had this back and forth in the past about top-down versus bottom-down. And I suppose really with everything else that we've been saying about diversity, probably a blend of both, as in anything else in life, is probably best. I would guess, rather than just one particular approach.
No, that's right. I mean, you've got to have both sides working, otherwise one will work against the other.
Mm-hmm.
If you just have a top-down approach, which is generally what you see, a top-down approach, the people go, those buggers, they're making us do this. We don't want to do that. So you've got to have the bottom working and the top working, and they need to be working towards the same goal. But they have to know what the goal is that they're working towards. Therein lies the challenge. Yeah, you're right. I think you have to work from both ends, but I do not believe that the top-down approach is the solution. We're going to get more traction from the bottom up, and the top-down will support the bottom-up approach, not the other way around. The driver has to be the bottom-up, and the top-down supports it.
And do you agree with what I was saying before, that part of what will drive that bottom-up approach and the people on the bottom is selling these people a compelling vision of transformation rather than breaking it down into its constituent parts?
Of course, but it must be reality, not bullshit.
Absolutely.
Because people, I think we've reached the point now, thankfully, almost, maybe we haven't, but we're getting closer, that people are looking at the bullshit and pushing that to one side, and they're they're driving for reality. They want to know what's real, not the fluff. Yep. So we've got to eliminate the fluff and come up with the real. So it's got to be something that's real, that we can see, we can touch, that people can work towards.
So on that note, where do you go from here? Where does Stuart Andrews go from here?
Well, we just keep doing the same thing we're doing now, and we keep training farmers, and with our farm at Forage Farms, what we're about is connecting with the consumer. So at that end, we produce food and we sell direct to the consumer. So we have a direct contact with the people that buy our food, which is only minuscule, but we're just a small microcosm of something that could be replicated everywhere. Yep. So we do that. So we're talking to the small number of consumers that we have working there at the same time as we work with the farmers. And so if we can educate farmers to have the tools at their disposal, when the consumers finally go, well, this is what we want, we've already got the farmers educated to know how to do it. Because that's the problem. There's not much point having all the consumers saying, well, I want this, and they're not having the farmers knowing how to do it because we've got to play catch up. Yep. So everything has to work in unison and everything will happen over time. Everyone wants it to happen yesterday, but it can't. We can only work day by day. So that's what we'll continue to do. We'll continue to do the same thing till I guess I can't do it anymore. And every person that we educate becomes the educator for the next person. It can't be ownership. You know, the philosophy that we have and with our training, we train people to then have them train others. It can't be us owning it and maintaining it because that doesn't work. You know, it has to be put the information out there and allow it to move out through the networks everywhere.
Well, and that enables people to make mistakes. People have to make their own mistakes and learn and stumble.
Away.
Well, yeah, it goes back to something very fetching Napoleon Hill said in one of his lectures. If you're not going to learn from your mistakes, better off not making them in the first place. In other words, learn from your mistakes. And you have to learn by doing.
I mean, you know, I hear it all the time, you know, and I had it when I grew up. My old man would say to me, learn from what I made, the mistakes I made. Well, what you don't realize, Dad, is that I don't learn from your mistakes. I learn from mine, which are the same mistakes that you made. Yeah. But the more you tell me not to make your mistakes, the more I will go and make your mistakes. If you stop telling me not to make your mistakes, I'm more than likely not to make them. Because this is the reverse psychology. You realize, like I told we got 2 sons, and they run the farm in Queensland, while Megan and I are running around the countryside doing training. And I said to them from a young age, don't be farmers. There's no future in being a farmer. And now both of them are bloody farmers. I didn't do that deliberately. I didn't even realize. Maybe subconsciously I'm thinking, well, if I tell them not to do it, they'll probably do it. And here we go. Here they are, and they're doing a fantastic job. And Hamish, the oldest son, he works in the training business. He does all of our IT stuff, all of our websites, all of that. Organizers, tells me where I've got to go. And, you know, so that's just the way it has to be. You know, if fathers or mothers or guidance mentors tell people to stop, don't make the mistakes that I made, then the person will actually probably not make the mistakes, because they'll make it, their head will be the one to say, oh, gee, look, he did that over there and he made that mistake. Maybe I shouldn't do that, rather than be told, don't do that. Yeah.
Well, and you have to make your mistakes in order to learn what you need to learn. Because
Correct.
What Stuart Andrews needs to learn from his mistakes and Dante Ciolfi needs to learn from his mistakes, those are distinct things from what Bart Colen needs to learn from his mistakes. I almost need to have my own mistakes because I'm a distinct individual from everyone else, as is everyone else.
You know what the important thing is, and I try to explain this to people when they come and do our course, or actually any time really, but particularly at our course, is out there in the landscape there are patterns. And the patterns are the same all around the world. The patterns of how water moves is exactly the same everywhere throughout the world. Every human being on this planet has a pattern. Now, the most crucial thing you should do as a person is look at yourself and understand your patterns, because I guarantee you will make the same mistakes over and over and over again because you are creating the same patterns. So if you can understand your patterns, you can start to at least try to pull up from making the same mistake over and over and over again. I think if everybody stops and looks at their life, they'll realize they have made the same mistake over and over and over again. So understanding patterns and cycles are the key. You know, we talk about weather. They're all cycles. We go through cycles where it's wetter. We go through cycles where it's drier. And within the cycles, within a big cycle, there's smaller cycles. Within big patterns, there's little patterns. Everything is exactly the same. It's those components that we need to stop and look at and stop messing around with all of the other stuff. We just look at those patterns and the cycles. Done. Simple.
I always say once is an anomaly, twice is a pattern. If I'm driving
Correct.
down the road and I see a car in front of me, the brake light's going on for seemingly no good reason. The second time it happens, I drive further back from that person because I know they're going to keep braking at awkward times when they shouldn't be. And sure enough, if they do it twice, they do it 7 times within the next 2 miles of road. So yeah, you're right about recognizing patterns.
Yeah. If we can see that, you can understand people. Like most of what I do is not actually working in the landscape, it's working with people's minds. That's a big difference between, say, myself and my dad, is that he is absolutely fantastic at looking at landscapes, but cannot look at anyone's mind, has no empathy for people, and so he lacks that ability. Me, I tend to look more at the person and their mind, because at the end of the day, their mind is what stops them from doing something. If I can understand how they think, I will deliver a message that they can understand. And every person understands the same message in different ways. So therefore, me as a communicator, I must communicate the message in different ways. At one course, I may have to say the same message 4 or 5 different ways, because in that room with, say, 20 people, there are 5 different or more, sometimes 5 different thought processes going on amongst that group of people. And this is the problem when a message is delivered only one way, you only pick up a percentage of the population. The rest of them go, what? What did he say? No clue. Change the words, change the message, all of a sudden they go, oh, that makes sense. I get that. And so I'm working on the psychology, people's psychology.
Well, and that's, to me, in a lot of ways, human psychology is everything.
It is.
It's everything, because it's the saying, I forgot who said it, but it's this idea that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And if that isn't a truism, man alive, I don't know what is.
For sure.
Well, Stuart, thank you for being here. Before going to the closing here, if you don't mind my asking, given your reluctance to advocate a top-down approach, what would you suggest to someone like me, but also to me, who's looking to consult in the field in relation to doing positive development work? What sort of approach would you suggest in relation to that for potentially being able to implement things like natural sequence farming overseas?
Well, the first thing you need to do is to look at yourself and understand where you fit, because it's more important that you fit in the right place rather than the wrong place. So it's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It don't work. So you need to look at your role. Where do you fit best? Now, if you actually fit best in talking to the people at the top, and I go and put you to talk to the people at the bottom, they aren't going to understand your message, right? So you need to understand where you fit before I can answer that question. Yep. So if you feel that your ability to communicate is going to be better spent communicating with the people at the top, then that's where you should be communicating. If you're better at communicating with the people at the bottom, then that's where you should be communicating. Me, I'm better at communicating with the people at the bottom because I just piss the people at the top off. So I shouldn't be there. Yep. Right? So I communicate with the people that I feel I'm best to communicate with. And that's the people who can actually make the most amount of change. But, so that's what you need to work out. Where do you fit?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because again, that comes back to this point of diversity, that in a team, and you would want a team for this kind of stuff, it's having a diversity in that team where you have the Stuart Andrews of the world who is able very easily to communicate with the farmers, and other people who are maybe more comfortable speaking with the people at the top. And so rather than having a team full of all the same types of people, it's not a balance, it's a blend. You're blending your team together so that the right people at the right layers are giving the right messages, which are being received in the right way. Again, to me, that would seem to imply diversity of approach.
Yeah, I mean, you use the word team. You know, the old saying is there's no I in team. But if you look at a lot of businesses that are not successful, that's how they work. They work where there's an I and no team. You know, so the people at the top believe they're important, and the people at the bottom are just the people who do the hard yards. But if they don't have the people at the bottom doing the hard yards, there is no business. You know, so you must have all of them. So you have a team, you must have all different personalities, all different skills. If you don't have a team and you don't have success. You know, for me, like in our training business, I've got all of these different people that I work with that are not the same personality as me. I must have in the room, if we have 20 people, 20 participants in the room, I must have a couple of different personalities because I'm intimidating. I know that. I see that because I have a confidence in this area, because I know what I'm doing. So I have a natural confidence, which some people find off-putting. And that's fine. I get that. So therefore they need a personality that's not like mine, because that person, if they want to ask a question will ask the question of the person that they don't find intimidating. I don't mean to be intimidating. It's just how it is. And that other person, you know, I think about one of the guys, he would be what you would define as close on a hippie. You know, he certainly grew up in that era. He liked to, you know, have the occasional chuff and whatnot. Fantastic bloke, not like me, right? Now, if there was a hard-ass farmer, he's not going to go to him and ask a question, yeah? But if there's someone who's not a farmer but are looking to come into farming, are a little bit softer, probably find me intimidating, they'd go to him and ask the question. So we must have all those different personalities, otherwise we don't get the connection. So you're right, you know, that's what we require. But me, what I think I'm good at doing is putting the right person in the right place at the right time.
There was the quote, and I appreciate you saying that, because there's the quote, can't remember if it was Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, something like that. I think Steve Wozniak asked Steve Jobs, "You're not a coder, you're not a marketer, what do you do?" And his response was, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like, "A musician plays the instrument, I play the orchestra." And it is having that awareness to know where you fit within a given team, and to recognize that different people have different talents and abilities to draw those things out of people. Because that actually, in the episode last week that Dante and I filmed talking about positive development, that was actually such a key theme, was collaboration, was interpersonal dynamics, was working with people effectively, was learning what people do best and learning what appeals most and speaks most strongly to the individual or groups of individuals in question. And I think with everything you were just saying, you've underscored that point.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got to recognize that, or we don't get the clarity and the message is not delivered because the people can't understand it. You have to have multiple different messengers delivering exactly the same message in a slightly different way, you know, and putting the wrong person in the wrong place with the wrong people will just end up with a bad result. Nothing wrong with the message. It was just the delivery was wrong person, you know, and you must, in this game, you must remove ego. And that's a big problem, you know, particularly in a lot of in this space where I work, there's a lot of big egos out there that, you know, people that I would consider to be visionaries, but their ego actually prevents them being leaders. So my old man is one case in point. He is a visionary, what he has been able to see in the landscape, nobody else or very few have been able to do. But he's had a huge difficulty in getting anyone to follow him because he doesn't have the skills of leadership. He's got a great message, a great vision, but he can't get people to follow him. So what people like he needs are people that can support him. So whatever areas he lacks, he needs others to fill. So, if we looked at the three of us here, well, like I've said, I'm happy to communicate with the farmers and in some cases the consumers. Sometimes my message is even too confusing for the consumer. So we probably need somebody else that can deliver my message to the consumer in a more simplified way. And maybe you can, Bart, you could be talking to the guys at the top or ladies at the top with a different message, and Dante, you're going to be somewhere in between. I don't know where your fit might be. You could be talking to the educating community, possibly.
Exactly.
Because most of those guys have got no clue about the message either, or a way of delivering it. Where I would struggle to talk to the educators, other educators that are in the education system, government education system, because they got no clue as to what I'm saying.
I might have to play devil's advocate, Stuart. I think, you intimated some aspect of your teaching that is integral to any pedagogy, which is meeting students where they are. So I would disagree with you. I think you would fit in well.
I think I'd fit in there well. I'm just not sure that the other educators would take me too kindly. I'm not sure. I'm probably a little bit black and white. And sometimes people find black and white, they'd rather a whole lot of grey and not so much black and white. But I am black and white. I call a spade, and it is what it is. You don't have to wonder. You'll know.
Well, it's interesting. And just to begin to wrap things up here, it's interesting. Firstly, I think you really nailed the distinction between the three of us and the audiences that we'd probably be best speaking with. So your facility as an amateur psychologist, I think, is pretty has not led you astray in that instance. So before we wrap up here and provide some of our viewers with where, and let Dante and me know where we can find the documentary, when it's going to happen, also how do people reach out to you. Before we get into that, I just want to double back. Dante, maybe if you have any closing questions or statements, or Stuart, anything from you, anything that anyone wants to ask or wrap up on before, as I said, we begin to wrap up here.
Yeah, I'd like Stuart to wrap up last, but I don't have anything other than, you read my mind, Bart. I want to know when and where that documentary comes out, because I've got to see that. I am excited about that.
Yeah,
it's early days, but it should, it's all going to obviously rely on the videographer and putting everything together, but I would hope that it'll be out sometime this year. Probably more than likely later this year, because I've got to get time, because we're going to travel around 5 states, because, Bart, you're probably aware that a lot of people have said, oh, it works there, but it doesn't work here.
Absolutely.
I've said, right, well, let's travel around the 5 states. You can't use that bullshit excuse anymore. It works here, it doesn't work there. Well, what about it's working up in central Queensland, southern Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania? So what other excuses do you want to come up with?
Stuart, you've got my pulse racing now, because, and I know, and I'm not going to name the name, but I know that you know exactly the person I'm talking about. That got my pulse racing, because I'm thinking of a certain gentleman in the first Australian Story episode saying exactly that same thing. Well, yeah, we know that it works on this landscape, but there are other landscapes in Australia where it's not so applicable. I know you know the exact person who was saying that. And as soon as you said that, that triggered me, because every time I watch that episode and I hear him saying it, I think, oh. So I'm really glad that you're going out there to...
Well, the thing is that this is the thing. It's I play the long game. I'm not playing the short game. And the long game, I always equate everything to, let's say you were going to war. It's not a war, but let's say you were going to war. If you were going to war, you would strategize firstly what the other side are going to do. Yep. So if you can strategize what the other side are going to do, you can now work out what you need to do. Yep. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to get things happening on the ground, at which point then we can satisfy what we know the other people are going to say is that, oh yeah, but it works here, but it doesn't work there. Well, we just nullify that by saying, well, it works here, there. They'll still say, oh yeah, but it works there, but it doesn't work here. But the people that matter will look through that because they'll realize that that's just someone trying to make up excuses, because they'll be able to see that, hold on, no, it does happen everywhere. You can do this.
And once you get the 15 and 20% of the people at the bottom as consumers, as advocates for this kind of stuff, once you reach that critical mass of support for this kind of stuff where people are willing to pay more and support these kinds of practices, then the people at the top who've been resistant the whole time will say, yeah, of course, no, we knew all along that this was the right thing to do.
The thing is that the only time you get action from the top is when the bottom demands it. So you have to have the majority demanding it and the top change. It's simple. That's why I don't believe the top-down approach, at least by itself, doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because you have a system operating where only half of it's working. It's only the top trying to do something, but the bottom aren't pushing hard enough to get it. And so you need to get the bottom pushing to get it. And farmers in Australia, I think we've got like 150,000 farmers and in a population of 26 million. 3 parts of bugger all. Farmers cannot change anything. Too small. You must go for the majority. And the majority of the people, thank Christ, eat. Therefore, food is the only solution. And food drives everything. So food needs to be the level. You can talk climate and all that shit and people don't care. They don't really care. You can tell them that the world's going to explode in 3 days and they're not going to even listen to you until it explodes. Yep. But if they do understand food and they know that with food, they can make a difference every time they go to the shop. They can make a difference.
And I think those shifts are happening within society where people from my mother's generation, when I went to spend a couple months on an organic farm in California some years ago, that to her, the idea of being a farmer was the most backward, I'm sure in her mind she's thinking, our family didn't leave Poland 150 years ago so that my son could be interested in farming. But there is that shift now where younger generations, where people like Lachlan and Hamish, your boys, are interested in this stuff that they might have thought wasn't very cool 50 years ago. And now, even though a lot of it's bullshit, and I realize that it is, still, when you go to the grocery store, there is labeling about sustainably sourced, ethically sourced. Even if a lot of that stuff doesn't necessarily have teeth, it at least shows that there is a wellspring of interest that I know from my 50 years of being alive was not there 30 years ago among consumers. So as much as we can split hairs and call bullshit on certain elements of it, I would say across the broader spectrum, there is certainly a greater degree of interest and care and concern than there was, say, 3 decades ago.
Tell you what, if you are the person that wants to work as a top-down approach, you need to contact RFK Jr. because he is someone that is going to drive this at as a higher level as you can possibly get. He's going to drive this in your country. And so if you want to start at the top, well, there's the top. That's where you want to be, because his focus is on health. How do we get health? It's by the way the food that we stick in our mouth is produced. So there you go. There's your solution. You're much closer than I am to be able to reach out to the likes of him. but he's got aligned with him a number of doctors that are of the same opinion. So there's your solutions. That's why I believe that your political system as it is now has a great opportunity to change the way the world thinks. Not that I want to boost the ego of you Americans any greater than I need to,
right.
but we are holding a whole lot of faith. I am at least a whole lot of faith in what happens there for what's going to happen here.
Well, a couple of points. You talk about the top down. It's your discussion of that and the role of people at different levels communicating to different audiences. Your explication of that has helped me more than you might realize, because I do see my role talking to maybe those higher up people, but you've emphasized something which I knew was important anyway, but you've reinforced the idea of the need to have a mix. It has to be a mix. You have to be engaging at all levels, and you have to have the appropriate people interfacing in the appropriate way with the appropriate people at the appropriate levels. So you've helped me personally, hopefully some of our viewers too, and Dante perhaps, but you certainly helped me more than you might realize in the way that you went about explaining that. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I do too, because that understanding of both entities working together, that removes inertia. It doesn't introduce inertia.
Gentlemen, I want to thank both of you for being here. Stuart, you're saying the documentary is going to come out later this year, hopefully. Do you know what platforms that will be released on? Or I suppose I can check with you and you can let me know and we can let our audience know.
I think Hamish was talking about utilizing YouTube, but I think if it's good enough, I don't know whether it will be, or we can only wait and see. But if it's good enough, I think there's a chance that we could spread it wider than just YouTube, like enter it into film things and whatever. I don't know. That's not my. I'm just a farmer, I got no clue about how any of that stuff works, so I'm just bullshitting, really.
Right.
That'll be up to the videographer to come up with those ideas. He's the storyteller. He comes up. He'll make the story. Anybody who wants to look up our stuff, they look up Tarwin Park Training or they look up Forage Farms. You'll see that there's a like a promo video there for each of those. The videographer that did those will be the one that will set up this documentary. He's a storyteller. He's very good at what he does. He understands natural sequence farming very well, and that's really key. If you're telling a story, for me at least, it's key that the person telling the story actually understands it. Otherwise, they're just purporting somebody else's message, which is just bullshit, really. They should understand it and believe it, because that then comes out in the cinematography that they use. And this guy, he does. He's very good.
So what I'll do is I'll put the information in the show notes for Forage Farms, Tarwin Park Training. Also include a link to the Australian story episode, which gives a pretty...
They're on our website, I think. The links for the
perfect
stories are on our website.
Perfect. And the Australian story episode will also give our viewers a little bit of an insight as to why Stuart really does not like a top-down approach, given quite honestly, all the bullshit you've had to deal with politically in Australia. I can't say I blame you.
Well, what I do is I observe, like I said, I observe patterns and I observe cycles. And I've watched how my old man has tried the top-down approach and had it not work. Well, quite possibly he was the wrong person to be talking.
The messenger, I would hope would make a difference. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, the messenger was certainly possibly, like taking a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer to drive that nail in is probably not the right approach. But nevertheless, even so, even with a different messenger, maybe they weren't necessarily the right place to deliver the message at that time. I think they probably are now. But they certainly weren't then. But anyway, yeah, you'll get that. People, if they watch those couple of stories, they might get a bit of a hint as to how things have transpired. why I have the views that I have.
Well, again, absolutely fantastic. So many things that you said are going to be things that I'm going to really have to mull over in relation to a great number of things. I know that our audience will get a lot out of this. So I really, really appreciate not only you being here, but the work that you're doing. I'm over the moon about the documentary you guys are doing. So thank you very much. And again, just to put a bow on all this, Dante, I want to say to you, as much as I appreciate having our guests here, you know I love a good team. You know I love collaboration. And being able to have you as part of this is something I appreciate. It really amplifies the quality of this. So thanks to both of you. This was absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank
Good.
you, Stuart. Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Bart. This was a fun episode. I gotta say, this was great.
Absolutely. And so to our audience, I will say thank you for watching, and until next time, onward and upward.